welcome to History 112, Lecture 29, U.S. Foreign Policy. In the popular mind, the interwar years are ones in which foreign policy really is framed with the idea of neutrality, but that's not necessarily the case behind the scenes. When the United States engaged might be referred to as peculiar isolationism. After World War I, politicians and people, by and large, reject the idea of taking an active role in world affairs, and that's very popular, but not universal. And that's kind of where the myth comes from. But while the United States is not going to pursue the Wilsonian course of active intervention, taking on a leading and active role in the world, it is going to stay actively engaged with the world as a whole. And really, this is going to be spun within the popular mind as the United States protecting its neutrality. There's going to be popular support for things like tariffs. But what really is going on is the United States is more active in world affairs than at any point previously. The United States had become a great power by 1900 and was increasingly engaged in that role after World War I. Now, the other great powers in 1919 are going to be Britain, France, Japan, and Italy, and the United States will be very actively engaged in foreign policy with them, and types of things that are all about balancing the considerations of these five major powers. Now, while the United States is not going to join the League of Nations, it is going to keep an observer there and it is going to expand the role of American diplomats. So while things are going on at the League of Nations, the American mind and the American presence is always there in the corridors. While they're not in the Assembly, everyone knows what the United States thinks, and the United States is very actively engaged in following the conversations and interjecting things. Now, the United States is also going to negotiate separate treaties with the former Central Powers, and these are not going to entangle the United States in the same way the Treaty of Versailles did. Now, Harding, as president, is going to pursue a foreign policy that is intended to do three things. First and foremost, safeguard the peace. Second, keep freedom of military action. In other words, he wants to ensure that the United States military can be used as and when it needs to protect the United States' economic interests, and most importantly as well, he wants to ensure the Allies repay their loans. There is an unwillingness by Republicans this time to forgive those loans, and the Allies owed about $11 billion, which is about 1.5 trillion in today's money. Now, this is going to require the United States to diplomatically intervene on several key issues during that time in order to make sure those three goals of safeguarding the peace, freedom of action, and loan repayment are met. One of the first key interventions is during the German default crisis of 1921. Because at the end of World War I, Germany had been forced to pay reparations, and the total amount that was settled on was 269 billion gold marks. Now, 269 billion Deutschmarks is about 100,000 tons of pure gold. Now, we have to keep in mind the entire history of man, only about 168,000 tons of pure gold have ever been mined. So we're talking about two-thirds of the world's gold supply would be needed if Germany was to pay off its debt all at once. Now, fortunately, Germany is not going to pay this off in gold. They're going to repay their debt with coal and steel. But as a result of some of the things and the policies they bring in to ensure those payments are being made, Germany begins to experience hyperinflation and prices start to spiral completely out of control. Now, when Germany defaults on its loan payments in 1921, French and Belgian forces are going to march into the Ruhr Valley. Now, this is the main center of the German coal and steel industry, and they're going to go ahead and take control of that and use that coal and steel to make sure that they're still receiving their payments. Even if they're not going to get cash, they're going to get the goods that Germany would have sold to go ahead and get that cash. And Germany is going to greatly resent this seizure. Now, Britain and the United States fear a couple of things. First, they fear this situation would spiral out of control and that Germany would be unable to repay their debts to either the United States or to Britain. And Britain, as well as France, are going to be struggling over their own debt to the United States. So everybody is concerned about these debt payments. On top of this, the United States is concerned that if the situation is not resolved, this could somehow in some way lead to another general war in Europe. Now, to intervene in this, the United States sets up what it calls the Dawes Commission, or the Reparations Adjustment Commission is its official name. And it's 10 experts who are going to be assembled and led by Charles Dawes, who's a well-connected American political figure. Also, he's going to win the Nobel Prize for his work in Germany, and he's going to become vice president or Calvin Coolidge a little bit later. And what he comes to is a 1924 agreement that says this: the Ruhr Valley will be evacuated by Allied troops. In other words, the Belgians and French will leave German territory. There will be fixed reparations payments that will be set at a level that Germany can reasonably pay, and the German banking system was going to be reorganized to help ensure fiscal solvency. And a lot of the reparation money would be coming from other new sources in terms of transportation, excise, and customs taxes. So as part of this intervention, the United States starts loaning large amounts of money to Germany, and Germany is going to use that money to pay Britain and France, who are then going to use that money to pay the United States. Now, this is what's called circular loans, and the point of this is couple fold. One is it's ensuring that Britain and France are not going to have any cause for complaint because the German loans are coming on time. And over time, what that means is it's also going to transfer the debt that Britain and France owe the United States over to Germany. Now, this is going to be bad financial practice in the long run, but that's not really as big of a deal for the United States bankers because what the United States is trying to do is simply prop up Germany to avoid a general war. So what they're doing is they're transferring the debt and they're kicking the problem down the line until much later. That way, the hope is that Germany will have a chance to recover and then Germany can start to repay those loans that they now have to the United States. Now, alongside this, American corporations are also going to take advantage and they're going to expand drastically on the continent and they're going to continue to do so right up until the Wall Street crash. And they're going to see about 10 billion worth of investments being made in Europe in the 1920s. And what that means is this is going to tie the US economy to what people fear will be an unstable European economy. And ironically, what people were afraid of was that a general crash of European markets would then negatively impact the United States. And in fact, what happens is the opposite. When an American crash crashes the European market. Now, this is also going to be coupled with things like high import tariffs, which are going to make it extremely costly for Europe to buy goods from the United States, and so on. And in short, the interest payments on circular loan cycle plus the high tariffs was going to ultimately make it increasingly difficult for these countries to pay their bills. And when the Great Depression kicks in, that's all going to cause this to come crashing down in Europe as well. In addition to bailing out Germany, the United States is very active in things like the Washington Armistice Conference, and really what these three treaties that are come out of this are all about is cleaning up some of the leftovers from imperialism in the Pacific. For example, one of the treaties is going to go ahead and guarantee the territorial integrity of China. Now, importantly, they're going to go ahead and limit warships, where for every 5 tons of warships held by the United States and Great Britain, Japan will be entitled to 3, and France and Italy will be entitled to 1.7. And the idea here is to prevent a very costly arms race, because if they all have a fixed ratio, then everyone will know and that what the size of the navies are, and they'll all have to come together to agree to increase or decrease their respective tonnage of warships. Now, what they're going to do is, even though they're going to come in with these ideas about preventing costly arms races, each power that's going to sign this is going to go ahead and try to find loopholes immediately to get around this. For example, pocket battleships, which are small, shrunk-down ships with an amazing amount of firepower, where they've cut down every single luxury to reduce the weight of the ship in order to get a little bit more tonnage out of that and get a little bit more firepower out of their allotment. Now, importantly, what we should realize is the United States is going to enter into these treaties and sign these arms limitations where the United States happens to have the biggest navy. So as a result of these treaties, the United States will scrap 15 battleships plus 2 more they were building. That is more warships being lost from this treaty than in any naval battle in American history. Another American diplomatic achievement was the highly idealistic Kellogg-Briand Pact, or the International Pact for the Outlawry of War. And this pact is going to ban aggressive but not defensive war. It importantly has no enforcement mechanisms, and unfortunately 13 of the 14 original signatories and 31 of the 48 countries that later accede to the treaty are going to be involved in the biggest war of all time. So we can't really regard this as successful, but it is going to lay the framework for later international law concepts such as crimes against peace, which is going to be one of the 4 charges that are used at the war crimes trials that conclude World War II. So in short, during the 1920s, U.S. foreign policy intended to accomplish certain goals: ensure repayment of loans, look after interests of business, the use of military force against weaker nations, and in particular looking at the enforcement of loans in places like Latin America, and avoiding direct military conflict with the other great powers. And many of the decisions of the 1920s are going to have long-term negative consequences. Now when Herbert Hoover comes in, he is going to follow the same basic idea, but he is also going to avoid the use of force in Latin America. Now, Hoover's policy in Latin America goes like this. First, he takes a note of the trend for democratic states to fail during the Great Depression to be replaced by dictatorships. He is going to attempt to avoid military intervention in Latin America because of the cost, and he's going to begin to work on ending the U.S. occupation of Haiti. And he's going to speed that along. Now, the occupation of Haiti had begun in 1915, and he's not going to end it during his term, but he is going to move it down that direction. Now, what Hoover is going to do is he's going to go ahead and recognize the de facto governments that exist regardless of how they came to power in Latin America. And he's going to refuse to send in troops when Latin American states default on loans, which would have been standard operating procedure in the 1920s. But this is during the Great Depression. He's looking at the cost of these foreign commitments. And what he basically says is, if Latin America defaults on a loan, we're just going to have to write it off because we can't afford the enforcement of these at this time. Now, with regards to Europe, Hoover's foreign policy is a little bit different. First, he proposes a moratorium on European debts. In other words, a indefinite halt on all loan payments. The loans won't be forgiven, it's just postponed until a future date until the economic crisis is over. And he is not willing to forgive debt, just delay it. Now, he's not going to get widespread support. Now, some people are going to be calling for complete loan forgiveness, and Hoover is not going to be willing to do that. And Hoover's inability to deal with the European debt crisis and get a deal through all the different parties is going to lead to increasing instability and to become a major contributing factor in the spread of fascism, especially in Germany and Spain. Now, with regards to Hoover's foreign policy in Asia, his biggest foreign policy failing is the Manchuria crisis, which we'll talk about when we start to talk about the rise of the Japanese Empire here in a bit. Now, at the end of Hoover's term, we essentially reached a situation where the American attempt to create a system of voluntary cooperation between nations has failed, and the United States is unwilling to commit resources to help failing states, and the United States is unwilling and unable to deal with the international debt crisis. This leaves America with a choice. Pursue a nationalistic foreign policy, in other words, simply do what's in the interest of the United States and worry about nothing else, or pursue a policy based on building more meaningful forms of cooperation between states. The problem for the United States is we're going to commit to neither, and we're going to try to do both. Now, one of the first things FDR is going to do as president is he's going to do something very nationalistic, something that's very much in American interest, but not an international interest. And he is going to drop what's called FDR's bombshell. Now, Hoover, when he was president, had committed the United States to participating in the World Economic Conference, which was designed to help deal with war debt and stabilize world currencies. Hoover believed that these were key to solving the crisis. Now, this conference is going to occur just a few months after FDR took office. So, in other words, Hoover lays all the groundwork, but FDR has to carry it out. Now, 66 nations are going to send their representatives, and FDR is going to shock them all, and his revelation is going to lead to the total collapse of the talk. And Britain and France are going to accuse FDR of torpedoing the talk, so to speak. Now, FDR is going to go ahead and reverse Hoover's commitment to currency stabilization. He says he needs the value of the dollar to fall in order to make U.S. exports more competitive, and he is going to take the United States off the gold standard and let the currency float. In other words, American dollar will be worth a combination of complicated formulas involving international trade. And he says he's not going to agree to more talks on the issue until the U.S. economy is beginning to pull out of the Great Depression. In other words, he says he's going to crash the U.S. currency internationally in order to strengthen it domestically and kickstart the U.S. economy. Now, this is going to have massive negative consequences for other trading partners. But FDR says it is simply what he has to do for America, and he's not prepared to consider any alternatives. Now, in the months that followed FDR's bombshell, he is going to work with European leaders, and he is going to agree to lower some tariffs on some goods, but he's going to be unwilling to do so if there was a potential to create competition with American goods. And that means that imports are going to lag because of the high taxes, and countries are not going to be able to pay their debts, and international trade really isn't getting any boost from these talks. Now, FDR is going to also reverse Hoover's policy on war debt. First and foremost, he's going to forbid banks to continue the circular loans. And what this means is the whole war debt payment cycle collapses because without those American loans to Germany, Germany can't pay France, France can't pay the United States, and so on. And FDR simply lets it all fall apart with the intent that once the crisis is over, we'll revisit with France and Britain where the money is they owe us, because at that point they'll be able to then pay it. Now, importantly, Hitler is going to very publicly refuse to make any further war debt payments when he comes to power, and because of FDR's policies about shutting down the circular loans, the whole war debt issue is allowed to die very quietly. But in Germany, Hitler makes this out as a great victory. Now, one important thing that FDR will try to do is he's going to attempt to expand American trade, and he's going to recognize the Soviet Union as part of that in the hopes that it's going to create new economic opportunities. The Soviets would be quite willing to do this because they have been diplomatically isolated, and they're eager for an ally against Japan. However, the new relationship is going to be very disappointing. American trade does not make a lot of progress in the Soviet Union, and the Soviets are not going to get the strong ally against Japan they wanted, and this agreement unfortunately leads to growing suspicion between both sides. Importantly, FDR is going to take Latin American foreign policy a very different direction. Now, he is going to go ahead and come up with a policy where we will cooperate with Latin America, we will assist Latin America, but we will not militarily intervene in Latin America. And he explains this as a good neighbor. He says that if your neighbor's house is on fire, you would want to lend your neighbor a hose because it helps, and you would want to help him fight the fire. But at the same time, that's your neighbor. You don't want to go coming in uninvited when there's not a crisis. So you want to work with things like cooperation and mutual respect because you would want that neighbor to help you if things were bad at your house. So that's the way FDR explains this. Now, importantly, in 1933, the Pan American Conference officially rejects intervention. The United States starts withdrawing the Marines from various places throughout Latin America where they're stationed, and we go ahead and officially renounce our protectorate over Cuba. Now, after 1933 and after this becomes policy, there's a variety of methods that are going to be used to exert influence over Latin America, like Pan-Americanism, the idea that we're all ultimately American from both continents. And support for strong leaders, training of National Guard, economic and cultural penetration, loans, financial supervision, and occasionally some political subversion. Now, by World War II, this behind-the-scenes policy of encouragement and supplying resources and help and assistance means that when we go into World War II, Latin America strongly supports the United States over a lot of the European powers. But importantly, the good neighbor policy is going to end when the Cold War kicks in after World War II. So what's the big idea here? Well, despite the reputation of this time period for being a period of neutrality, this is a period where U.S. foreign policy is highly active. In the 1920s, a lot of U.S. foreign policy is aimed at preserving the peace. But with the coming of the Great Depression, there are going to be some attempts to build better relationships with other countries, like, for example, what goes on with Latin America, while sometimes there are just going to be simply attempts to protect the U.S. economy at all costs, with FDR's bombshell being a good example of that. See you in the next lecture.